Scott Pilgrim could have had a much more depressing ending. Even outside of some of the more insane endings proposed, like the one where Scott was revealed to be a serial killer, in 1999, author Bryan Lee O'Malley wrote a webcomic that very closely parallels the Scott Pilgrim cast, specifically concerning Scott's relationship with Ramona Flowers, Chau, and Envy Adams. But the ending is kind of a downer. And when linking Scott Pilgrim to one of O'Malley's older comics about failed relationships, what better example than Scott's original failed relationship, Envy Adams? Hello again.
Friend of a friend.
Welcome to Zombie Comics, and this is Before Scott Pilgrim, a series where we examine the webcomic Scott Pilgrim author Bryan Lee O'Malley created before Scott Pilgrim Takes Off, Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, and even the Scott Pilgrim comics, and how they help to shape your favorite characters like Kim Pine, Ramona Flowers, Young Neil, and more. I usually appreciate if you like, subscribe, and all those kinds of things. I call this series Before Scott Pilgrim, but Envy Adams, in the context of Scott Pilgrim vs. the World and the Scott Pilgrim graphic novels, is literally before Scott Pilgrim, since the main story opens after the events of their breakup. While we see plenty of Ramona's evil exes, Natalie V. Adams, or
She who will not be named.
is the only evil ex of Scott. She's even a mini-boss in the Scott Pilgrim video game. We learn pretty quickly that she ruined Scott's life and is the entire reason he's had such a rough time over the past year. Or is she? See, Scott is the point of view character, meaning pretty much everything we see is filtered through Scott's perspective and memory, meaning that the real story of Scott and Envy's relationship is a lot more complex than just she's the bad guy. In fact, a lot of Scott's character arc is realizing that a lot of times, he was the bad guy. He was the evil ex-boyfriend. But enough about Scott, there's a million other channels to analyze his character. Let's focus on Envy. Similar to how Ramona Flowers had several real-life inspirations, Envy Adams had just as many apparently. Like several characters in the Scott Pilgrim cast, Envy Adams has her roots in O'Malley's real life. Not long before he started writing Volume 1, O'Malley would go through his own breakup and have what he would call an unforgettable ex. As for her looks, Envy was inspired by everything from music artists to anime characters. Specifically Asuka from the Neon Genesis franchise, a favorite of O'Malley's in high school. Another inspiration was Emily Haines. She was the lead singer and keyboardist of the Canadian band Metric. Her moves on stage would even be used as drawing reference for Envy's performances. And this connection would eventually come full circle. While Brie Larson performs Black Sheep in the movie itself, Metric would perform the song for the film soundtrack. That would seem like the coolest connection. I mean, the woman Envy Adams was based on got involved with the Scott Pilgrim movie. But there was another real-life inspiration that had an even stranger involvement with the film. For that, we need to check the Scott Pilgrim vs. the World audio commentary, with director Edgar Wright, Michael Bacall, and O'Malley himself. In it, they explain how Amy Bowles of the Toronto-based indie rock band Pony to Look fit into Envy's story.
Envy is kind of like an amalgam. Well, Emily Haines was only like a drawing reference, is that correct?
Yeah, I had just seen sort of, photos of Metric. Like, I listened to their first album, and, she's so theatrical in her costume and in her moves on stage.
But then also, there was another kind of singer that we have a link to. There's a Toronto band called Pony to Look, that's avant-garde, kind of almost like performance art.
Yeah, this sort of performance art rock kind of group. That were an inspiration for Clash of Demon Head, and it turns out to be Edgar's school friend.
Yeah, I went to school with her, and my brother went out with her. And when me and Brian were walking around Toronto, she rode past us on a bike and said, "Edgar?" And I hadn't seen her in like 10 years. And so we got chatting, and we arranged to kind of catch up and get a drink. And as she rode off on her bicycle, Brian said, "Is that the singer from Pony to Look?" And I said, "Yes, Amy Bowles. I went to school with her." And he goes, "She's one of the girls that inspired Envy," which is just insane.
Yeah.
What are the odds?
But a character is more than just looks and hobbies. While Brie Larson plays a fantastic version of the character, movie Envy is a very simplified version compared to the graphic novels. Though Larson certainly added a lot to her. The very breathy way that she talks was inspired by an adult actress. Kinda reframed some of her lines, huh? All Larson was told in her audition was that Envy had a husky, non-Ramona voice. She remembered seeing some adult actresses on the red carpet for the Adult Video Awards, which she randomly saw one night while flipping through channels.
Sure, Jan.
And after that, she was cast pretty quick. It certainly was a unique way to build out a character. She was even going to be given the one golden PG-13 F-bomb. Julie Powers possessed the super ability to generate censor bars whenever she said something vulgar, but so does Envy apparently.
For the record, I am so pissed off for you right now.
Shut the f, Julie.
That wasn't always the case though. Originally, this was gonna be completely uncensored, if not for a line earlier in that same scene. After Todd Ingram took a swing at Knives and
punched the highlights out of her hair,
Scott finally gets fed up with him.
That's it! You cocky cock!
That line apparently set off the censors, so they told filmmakers that they couldn't keep both that line and Envy's F-bomb. But honestly, I think it's funnier with the censor bleep. But when it comes to the story of Envy Adams, we need to know what actually went down between her and Scott. We get plenty of foreshadowing before she ever appears in person. I mean, the first reference to her is barely 25 pages in when Stacy Pilgrim says that it's been over a year since the breakup. Everyone constantly questions Scott's relationship with Knives. It's obviously just another coping mechanism to not address his trauma from the breakup. Julie Powers straight up says that Knives is the mourning period. But most of all, we're constantly told that it's all Envy's fault things ended so poorly. The initial story we're given is that Natalie was born in Montreal and grew up with her childhood friend Todd Ingram. The two never got the chance to date because Todd's family moved away when he was 11. They reconnected briefly before college, before Todd was shipped off to Vegan Academy. Meanwhile, Natalie would attend the University of Toronto. And this is where she met and eventually began dating Scott Pilgrim. Envy was kind of a nerd early in college with anime posters hanging all over her dorm. She met Scott through her roommate, Julie Powers, who was dating Stephen Stills at the time. Back then, Stephen was still Scott's best friend. He hadn't even met Wallace Wells yet, though he was slowly weaseling his way into Scott's life. Natalie, Scott, and Stephen would form a band called Kid Chameleon, which we first see in a flashback in Volume 1. But she began to change. She got rid of all her nerdy stuff, she started smoking, and changed her name to Envy, after her initials, N and V. Even their hangouts started changing. In one flashback where we see Scott, Stephen, Natalie, and Wallace playing games, she abruptly left in a very curt fashion. Wallace, who had only just started hanging out with the group, asked if she was always like this. As the band grew more and more popular, Natalie started adding more members to the band, without consulting Scott or Stephen. She essentially did a hostile takeover, and when they were offered to sign with a label, she took the deal, kicked Scott out of the band, broke his heart, and sent him on a downward spiral. Kid Chameleon collapsed, and the Clash at Demon Head was formed with Envy, Todd Ingram, and Lynette Guycott. That's the narrative we're given in the first few books. Envy apparently remembers things very differently, though. As the story goes on, we realize that we were only seeing one side of that story, Scott's side. We were seeing the perfect picturesque version of Natalie Adams when they first started dating, and only the worst moments of her change. See, Scott has a tendency to not just repress his mistakes and bad memories, he shoves them so deep down that he straight up forgets them. And that's actually what Nega Scott represents, all the bad decisions and shitty behavior that he refuses to address because this is the Scott Pilgrim series. He's the hero. He's not a bad person. He can't be. But when Envy appears in the current day, despite being told what an enormous unrelenting bitch she is, her actions don't always add up. She tries to reach out to Scott, to talk with him. She addresses him like a person who's been hurt by him. I'm not ignoring the fact that Envy was pretty awful to Scott too. She certainly changed. She became much colder and condescending to people. The fame went to her head, and she made some shitty choices that hurt the people around her. But this is a series all about how we frame ourselves as the hero of our own story and justify our bad actions. She's no more guilty than the rest of the characters, but she's certainly painted that way. Early on, we see glimpses of other moments that wouldn't paint Scott in a very flattering light, namely a certain New Year's party. Stephen Stills asked if Scott remembered having a fight with Envy, and Scott straight up says no. He doesn't remember it at all, and that's because it was his fault. He got completely drunk and started a fight with Envy. But what is the only moment of that night we see? The one that paints Scott as the victim. In fact, she point blank calls him out for this kind of behavior in book 6, saying he makes her out to be some kind of villainess and that he was no paragon of virtue, which he insists that he was. But by this point, readers had seen firsthand that Scott is an unreliable narrator at best. All Scott remembers about the New Year's party is that Envy broke his heart, but Envy reveals that the night made her feel the same way. She tells Scott that he's literally blocked out everything of their relationship except for the parts he wanted to remember. And yeah, she's right, he tends to do that. A perfect second example is with Kim Pine. Scott tells a story of fighting the evil Simon Lee in order to date her, but Kim reveals that he was a very non-intimidating Chinese kid who was dating Kim before Scott just beat him up. But that's not heroic, so Scott reframed it in his mind. And actually, it's not just Scott guilty of this either. We see Gideon Graves viewing his relationship with Ramona in the same light. Envy herself remembers a storybook version of her relationship with Todd Ingram. The idea of damaged people damaging more people in an endless cycle is a central conflict in the series. Envy might be an antagonist in Scott Pilgrim's tale, but to her, the story is all about her romance with Todd Ingram. When she recounts her backstory, it's all about them. She even dismisses her other relationships because admitting she ever loved anyone else would ruin her narrative of the perfect lovers who couldn't be together. As long as everyone keeps thinking of themselves as the hero, they're never going to find any real closure. They're never going to escape the cycle. And in most of the series, Scott and Envy don't get any closure. For a while, it seems like Scott wouldn't get any closure with Ramona either. Things were heading in a pretty depressing direction by the end of Volume 5. But it's a story that repeats more than once through O'Malley's works. In 1999, Scott Pilgrim author Bryan Lee O'Malley was attending an avant-garde film class, and he would create an online comic for it. This was Untitled. No, it wasn't Untitled, it was literally titled Untitled. O'Malley considers this his pretentious comic. The comic only has one named character, a girl named Rose, but she's not even the main character. The story is told from the point of view of her ex. They were together for an entire year, but it's been 2 years since they've even seen each other. And they had zero closure because, as Rose's ex puts it, she just disappeared. A tactic Ramona Flowers is no stranger to, leaving all of her exes, including Scott Pilgrim, in a state of confused limbo. However, for Rose's ex, the fateful day comes when he sees her for the first time after she disappeared. She's on the other side of the street, standing beneath signs for a cafe and law firm. Suddenly, everything comes rushing back to him. He thought things would work out. He thought that they'd stay together, but now admits that everything may have been a mistake. He was messed up before they started going out. Dating Rose was a band-aid solution, so he didn't have to deal with his own baggage. Once she was gone, though, he had to face himself. As they cross the street, they make eye contact but say nothing, and he wonders if he'll ever see Rose again, saying that agony is not knowing. In another universe, this comic feels like an alternate, more depressing Scott Pilgrim ending, which certainly changed more than once. He would have gotten together with Knives Chau in one ending. In another, we would have found out that Scott was a serial killer who was taking out Ramona's 7 exes. Yes, this was a real ending that was considered. In yet another possible ending, Scott would have defeated Gideon Graves only to end the series alone. And that last one was in strong contention to be the actual ending of Scott Pilgrim. No Knives, no Ramona, no Kim, and no Envy. So what if, just as a thought, Ramona left Scott and never came back? Just like Rose and her ex in Untitled. Scott Pilgrim would have to deal with having no closure with her, the same as his breakup with Envy Adams. He'd have to learn to live with his choices until one day he might inevitably run into one of his exes. And in this hypothetical ending, would there be anything to say or just glances of regret? Well, agony is not knowing. O'Malley has long been fascinated with the idea of breakups. He tackled it in several of his webcomics, Raleigh from Lost at Sea spirals for pretty much the entire graphic novel about her breakup with Stillman, and of course, the messiness of relationships takes center stage in Scott Pilgrim. Untitled isn't one of his longer or more in-depth comics, the analysis is pretty straightforward, and he's retold its themes far better in his other works. But when put up against Scott Pilgrim specifically, the comparisons are pretty in your face. A damaged guy jumps into a relationship as a band-aid solution to avoid addressing his own baggage, only for it to end and lead to further awkward encounters. Who knows, maybe Rose's ex had his own Envy Adams before dating Rose. Except for him and Rose, they didn't get any fantastic adventures, cult classic movies, or a chance at a happy ending. Though I'm not sure anyone in Scott Pilgrim gets a traditionally happy ending, just a chance to move on and be better. And after Todd Ingram, Envy tries to move on. She has a thing with Gideon, but she's clearly unhappy. I mean, he's still obsessed with Ramona, who wouldn't be unhappy in that situation. And after he's out of the picture, all that's left is her career and her past. She approaches Scott and gives him a hug, a gesture that they've grown, finally giving them closure. Envy gets back to center stage and does what she does best: perform. What happens to her beyond that is a mystery, but at least she's trying to move forward with her life just like the rest of the cast. And really, I think that's the best ending she could have. But with that, you've been watching Zombie Comics, and I'll catch you on the flip side. See ya!